Shalom Chaverim, hello friends, I'm Rabbi Stern, and welcome back to another video. Today we'll be taking a look at John Green's Crash Course series, specifically their course on the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. We're going to see what we can add based on my knowledge of having lived in Israel and visited places in the Palestinian territories, and dealt with people from across the political spectrum and across the ideological spectrum. So we're going to see what we can add and see how his video stacks up. Please remember to subscribe to this channel and like the video and add your comments as to what you think so that we can grow this community. And now, let's get to the video. All right, Mr. Green, take it away.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about Israel and Palestine, hopefully without a flame war. Yeah, big ask, Mr. Green. I mean, that fight goes back thousands and thousands of years. Except thousands of years ago, there wasn't an Islam yet, so yeah, no. Also, let me submit that very little of this conflict between Israel and Palestine over the last several decades has been about, theological differences between Islam and Judaism. No one's arguing about whether the most important prophets descended from Abraham's son Isaac or his son Ishmael, right? It's not about whether to fast during Yom Kippur or Ramadan. It's about land. Portraying the conflict as eternal or as religious makes it feel intractable in a way that frankly it isn't. So instead, let's begin, as most historians do, in the late 19th century.
He's fair to start in the late 19th century. I think that it's important to note that while religion plays a role in this conflict, it's certainly not a continuation. As he pointed out, it's not a continuation of the conflict that we saw between Isaac and Ishmael, two brothers, sons of Abraham by different mothers. So it's not really related to that. Maybe if we were all one religion, it would be easier, but maybe not. We see many places in the world, in Yemen right now, there's a civil war, and people on both sides of that are Muslim. There are civil wars that have happened throughout history that are not based on religion, and there are wars between countries that aren't based on religion. So it's important to note that this is not necessarily a religious conflict, though religion does play a role, especially in inciting some of the worst actors, both extremists on the Israeli side and, of course, extremists like the terrorist groups Hamas and Hezbollah, who actively try and kill civilians and often use religious language and the lies of threats to religious places as their fodder for and their reason for committing terrorism. So, absolutely, he's right.
Talking about religion, let's follow the lead of historians like James Gelvin and discuss competing nationalisms. Okay, so in the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire ruled over what we now know as Palestine. The population there, according to Ottoman records from 1878, was 87% Muslim, 10% Christian, and 3% Jewish. Everybody spoke Arabic as the daily language.
Yes, that's true. The Ottoman Empire, a Muslim empire who had been there for a very, very, very long time, made it very difficult for Jews to live there. And that was really what happened up from the last major exile of Jews from the land, Judea, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, Palestine, whatever you want to call the land as a geographical entity. Jews had their major exile from there in the year 70 of the Common Era, and subsequent administrations made it extremely difficult for Jews to live there. And they often the Romans would forbid them from living in Jerusalem and in parts of the area. And yet we saw that there was always a consistent Jewish presence in the land. There was never a time when it was totally without Jewish inhabitants. So I think he has to get that, because if he's talking about competing nationalisms, Jewish nationalism goes back to, which we have archaeological records for, the kingdoms of Israel, and then the kingdom of Israel, and then the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, which were Jewish kingdoms that existed 3,000 years ago in this land. And subsequent Jewish states have existed there on and off from around the year 1000 up through 70 CE. And that was the end of the destruction of the Jewish temple, but also the end of kind of one of the last hopes for Jewish sovereignty to return to the land.
And in Jerusalem, the religious populations were roughly equal. To give you a sense of life in Ottoman Palestine, an Arab Orthodox Christian musician named Wasif Jaharia grew up in Jerusalem in the first decade of the 20th century, learning the Quran in school and celebrating both Passover and Eid with his Jewish and Muslim neighbors. Ottoman Palestine was, in short, a place in which people of different religious faiths lived peacefully together. All right, let's go to the thought bubble.
Okay. I have to disagree with him here. Ottoman Palestine was a place where people could get along so long as everybody knew their place. And I think today, especially in 21st century America and in many places around the world, we note that the idea that people are safe so long as they recognize their place as lesser than other people is not, in fact, some egalitarian, wonderful society. So I'm a little disappointed to hear him phrase it that way. Jews and Christians had to pay certain taxes just for being, called the jizya, just for being non-Muslims, essentially. So I think it's a little disingenuous to claim that this was a religiously equal paradise when the Ottomans ruled the area. That's certainly not true. And it remained not true when the British ruled the area. And it's more true now under the control of Israel than it ever has been.
The 19th century was the golden age of nationalism in Europe, and no place was crazier than the Habsburg Austro-Hungarian Empire.
True, they had a lot of nations.
10 different nations all wanted their own state. And in that hyper-nationalistic empire lived a Jewish journalist named Theodor Herzl, who had hoped that Jews could assimilate into European nations, but soon became convinced that the Jewish people needed to leave Europe and settle in their own state. The concept of Jewish nationalism came to be known as Zionism. It's important to keep in mind that most Zionists were secular Jews, so they imagined Israel as a state for Jews more than a Jewish state. In 1917, the British government, hoping to gain the support of Jewish people, issued the Balfour Declaration, promising, quote, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. A bold promise considering that Palestine was still technically Ottoman, as they hadn't yet lost World War I. Of course, they
Ottoman,
would soon, but it turned...
The British never really did anything to help that. They ended up issuing a white paper preventing Jews from immigrating there, especially as Jews became more and more under threat in Europe. So the Balfour Declaration is great, but since the British ended up stopping Jews from leaving Europe for Israel, Palestine in the 20s and 30s, it's really not anything that made any difference.
The British were over-promisers when it came to Palestine because a year before the Balfour Declaration, the British had secretly promised the French that they would divide up the Arab territories and the Brits would keep Palestine. Furthermore, in 1915, other British officials had promised the ruler of Mecca, Sharif Hussein, that he would rule over an Arab state, including Palestine, if he led an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule, which Hussein promptly did. So basically, the Brits had promised Palestine to the Meccans, to themselves, and to the Zionists. What could go wrong? Thanks, Thought Bubble. So shortly after the end of the war, the British established a colony in Palestine with the idea that they'd rule until the Palestinians were ready to govern themselves. At which point the people living in Palestine were like, well, now seems good. And the British were like, yeah, but maybe not just yet. Meanwhile, the British established separate institutions for Christians, Jews, and Muslims, making it difficult for Palestinian Christians and Muslims to cooperate and easier for the British to, quote, divide and rule the inhabitants of Palestine. Again, what could go wrong? Meanwhile, the British did attempt to honor the Balfour Declaration's promise to, quote, facilitate Jewish immigration under suitable conditions. Between 1920 and 1939, the Jewish population of Palestine increased by over 320,000 people. In fact, by 1930...
I gotta stop this guy again. I'm sorry, and I like his videos. I'm not here to tear down what Mr. Green is doing, but the numbers increased by people immigrating illegally. The British had strict quotas, and certainly by 1929, they had hoped to basically turn down or off the tap of Jewish immigrants to the land of Israel. And it was only through the efforts of Zionist leaders facilitating, I don't know how to put it, it's illegal immigration, right? The British had rules and the Zionist leaders wanted to get around it so that Jews could escape Europe. But to say that just because they succeeded and there were more Jews means the British kept their promise is super disingenuous.
Jews were just under 30% of the population of Palestine. And the growing Jewish population focused on purchasing land from absentee non-Palestinian Arab landowners and then evicting Palestinian farmers who were living and working there. By controlling both the land and the labor, they hoped to establish a more secure community within Palestine. But of course, these practices heightened tensions between Jewish...
Tensions, he's right, that would heighten tensions if Jews were buying land just to kick off other Palestinians, since all Jews, Muslims, Christians were all known as Palestinians at this time. The Palestine Post is now called the Jerusalem Post, but was a Jewish newspaper. And if you look up the World Book's image of flags from that period, the flag of Palestine is a half blue, half white flag with the gold Star of David in the middle. Now, he says that the Jews bought the land and then kicked off the Palestinian farmers. But these were essentially squatters on land owned by Ottomans and others that weren't actually using it or living there. So the Jews would buy the land. Imagine if you bought a house. You bought a house and you found out that that person hadn't actually been living, the person you bought it from, who had held the deed, hadn't actually been living in that house for a while. And you went there and saw that there was somebody already living in the house. Well, you bought the house. You'd say, no, I want to live in this house now. You don't get to keep living in this house just because you were squatting and I and this other guy didn't know. That wouldn't be fair to you either. So a reframing is necessary from Mr. Green's point.
People and Arab Palestinians during the 1920s and 1930s. Along the way, Palestinian Arabs began to think of themselves as the Palestinian nation, and that growing sense of
flag didn't exist till the 60s.
erupted in 1936 when the Palestinians revolted against the British. With the help of Jewish militias, the British brutally suppressed the Palestinian revolt, but in the aftermath, the British issued a white paper limiting Jewish immigration to Palestine and...
Yes, that is that white paper I was talking about, limiting Jewish immigration. It wasn't that the British and the Jews worked together to suppress the Palestinians. That's, again, a reading that I think he wants to make that there isn't historical evidence for. The Jews were protecting themselves from being attacked in various large-scale pogroms in the late 1920s. And so when they protected themselves, it might look like they were aiding the British, but it wasn't anything to help the British. Jewish insurgency groups would later fight the British to help continue Jewish immigration, especially during the Holocaust, when Britain still was not eager to have Jews move to the land of Israel or Palestine.
Calling for the establishment of a joint Arab and Jewish state in Palestine within 10 years. This managed to leave no one happy. The Zionists were angry at Britain for limiting Jewish immigration at a time when Jews particularly needed to leave Europe, and the Arab Palestinians were unhappy about the prospect of waiting 10 years for a state. And then came World War II, which was actually quite a peaceful time in Palestine. But then it ended and tensions resumed.
Hold on. You're going to gloss over World War II. You're going to gloss over World War II. You're going to ditch the Jewish brigade that fought in the British Army to fight Hitler. You're going to throw out David Ben-Gurion's famous phrase that we will fight the white paper, the British, as if there was no war, and we'll fight the war as if there were no British, that we're the Jewish people in Palestine are committed to both freeing Jewish people in Europe and freeing the world, and also for their own legitimate national rights in the land of Israel. You're going to throw that out. You're also going to throw out the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, a major leader of the Muslim community in Palestine, sitting down with Hitler, talking with Hitler, saying how they shared the same aims of ridding themselves of the Jews. You're really starting to show a kind of a one-sided view of this.
And the British realized that colonies like Palestine were far more trouble than they were worth, so they handed the issue of Palestine over to the newly created United Nations. They were like, oh, hey there, United Nations, for your first problem. So in November of 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine into separate Palestinian and Jewish states. The partition plan called for two states roughly equal in size, but the borders looked like a jigsaw puzzle. I mean, you do not look at this map and think, yeah, that's gonna work. Sure enough, it didn't. And soon after the plan was announced, the cleverly named 1948 Arab-Israeli War broke out, with Israel on the one side and the Palestinians and many Arab states on the other.
The war broke out because the British announced, after that 1947 plan that the UN proposed was rejected by the Arab Palestinians and was accepted by the Jewish Zionist leadership, the British announced that in May of 1948, their mandate over the place was going to expire. They were just done. They were leaving. And fair enough. World War II had bankrupted them, and they were done. And so much the better for no more empire, even though, that's the way it goes. So much the better for no more empire. That being said, there was a gap. No one was sure what would happen after the British left. And right before the mandate was set to expire, the Zionist leadership gathered, and David Ben-Gurion declared that for the first time in almost 2,000 years, there would be a Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael once again. It was met with jubilation in the streets by Jewish people who had been longing for 2,000 years for a place they had sovereignty, a place that could be home for the Jewish people.
Israelis won, and when an armistice was signed in 1949, Israel occupied a third more land than they would have had under the UN proposal. Meanwhile,
so you should have accepted the proposal then.
Jordan controlled and later annexed the West Bank and the Old City of Jerusalem, and Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip.
Jordan controlled and annexed the West Bank. Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip. Neither gave citizenship in their countries to the Arab Palestinians who were living there. Neither of them did.
100,000 Palestinians fled their homes and became refugees in the surrounding Arab countries. And to Israelis, this war was the beginning of their nation. To the Palestinians, it was the Nakba.
So it's Nakba, a catastrophe. Yes, 700,000 Palestinians fled their homes. Many were urged to do so by Arab leaders. Some were evicted by the Israeli military, who found that militant groups were unable to stay in a certain area. There were, famously, many Arab villages that chose not to fight Israel and were allowed to stay, and did stay, and still exist today. So it's a little more complicated than this. It also should be mentioned that 1 million Jews were shortly after this war was over, were kicked out of Arab countries and Muslim countries and had nowhere to go but Israel. So Israel took them in. Meanwhile, these 700,000 Palestinians are still called refugees today. They're descendants, which no other cause on earth gets to claim this kind of refugee status. So these people are forever refugees, not given citizenship in the lands they live in. Meanwhile, Israel gave citizenship to all of these Jews kicked out of Arab lands. It's called the Farhud, look it up. And it boggles the mind that this is how it's presented.
Catastrophe as they became stateless. Over the next 18 years, nothing changed territorially, and then in 1967, Israel and several Arab states went to war again. It was called the 6 Days War because, get this, it lasted 6 days. Israel won and then gained control over the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. So the 1947 proposal looked like this. By 1967, things looked like this. Then the UN passed Resolution 242. Man, they are good at naming resolutions, which outlined a basic framework for achieving peace, including Israel withdrawing from the territory acquired in the war, and all participants recognizing the rights of both a Palestinian and an Israeli state to exist. This, of course, did not happen. After the war, the broader Israeli-Arab conflict morphed into a more specific Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this is...
You can't say that without mentioning the Arab League meeting to say, we won't talk to Israel, nobody makes peace with Israel, nobody makes deals with Israel, none of it. So it's really, to me, again, you're mentioning it as if there was something that could have happened or that the conflict became more specialized to Israel and Palestinians and not the larger Israeli-Arab conflict. But at that time, it certainly still was very much the Israeli-Arab conflict. A collection of Arab nations had invaded Israel twice, and they would still do so again in 1973, which hasn't even come up yet.
Nice moment to note that not all Muslims are Arabs, not all Arabs are Palestinians, and not all Palestinians are Muslims. Like, there's a significant Christian minority of Palestinians, for instance. Palestinian is a word used to describe the ethnic identity of those who have historically lived in Palestine. There were, for instance, lots of Christians in the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, formed in 1964 and led by Yasser Arafat. The PLO oversaw guerrilla groups that attacked civilians, but also used nonviolent approaches to try to achieve a Palestinian state. And meanwhile,
but mostly organized groups that killed civilians.
The Israeli government began to establish Jewish settlements in what had been Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem.
There had never been a Palestinian territory. There is still, I'm someone who hopes for a two-state solution. I think it's the best possible way to go, and I think it fulfills the legitimate national aspirations of two distinct peoples. That being said, it went from being many different countries over history. It was Ottoman, it was British, it was Israeli, or it was Egyptian, or it was Jordanian. One thing it never was Palestinian. So to say that, they took over Palestinian land and settled on it, it's a lot more complicated than that. And I get this is a crash course, but I'm seriously disturbed by what I'm hearing from Mr. Green. I'm really sad about it.
The West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. There are now over 350,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank and over 200,000 in East Jerusalem. And
it's way more than that now, by the way. There are way more Jews living in the West Bank now. It's also worth noting East Jerusalem is a really nebulous term, it turns out, because parts of East Jerusalem are basically in Ramallah. Parts of East Jerusalem are very clearly areas that would be Palestinian in any peace deal. And parts of East Jerusalem are places 1 block away from major Jewish sites or major Jewish population centers. And so somebody wants to buy an apartment a block away from their neighbor, and suddenly they're told it's over a line that's never really been recognized by anyone, short of map makers, and that they're a settler in East Jerusalem. So there's many different kinds of settlers if he's going to be that broad.
Settlements are illegal according to international law, but Israel counters by saying that they aren't really illegal because Palestine isn't really a state. By the late 1980s, Palestinians launched the first intifada, which literally means shaking off. And this began with boycotts of Israeli products and services and refusing to pay Israeli taxes. But when the Israeli armed forces cracked down on protesters, violence ensued. And the first intifada also saw the founding of Hamas, which launched the first suicide bombing against Israel in 1993. Hamas gained support partly because of its militancy, but mostly because of its social welfare projects in Gaza. It built and staffed schools, mosques, and clinics. The most important...
That's not wrong. The main difference is the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and Fatah, its main party, that Yasser Arafat was the leader of, and now Mahmoud Abbas, who was his successor, who is in year 25 of a 5-year term. It's hard to keep track since they haven't had elections in a long time. But there's that group that it represents secular Arab nationalists. Secular Arab nationalism hasn't really been a major thing in a while in the Middle East, but it used to be really big with Gamal Abdel Nasser and Syria and Egypt forming the United Arab Republic, and there used to be a dream of a pan-Arab state that's kind of faded since most of those states can't get along, let alone dislodge Israel, which is key to their plans. Hamas was not a secular organization. It's an Islamist organization representing an extreme view of Islam that does not represent what most Muslims believe. They did provide social programs, and now they run the Gaza Strip since they fought a civil war with the PLO in 2006, 2007. And so it's really, again, it's so much more complicated, and I think it's getting a little short shrift here.
Of the First Intifada was the emergence of peace talks between Palestinians and Israelis. This led to the Oslo Accords and a peace process based on our old friend United Nations Security Council Resolution 242. But there were a lot of issues to resolve. I mean, putting aside the question of how to make two states that don't look like a jigsaw puzzle, there was the question of the Jewish settlement and the right for Palestinian refugees and their descendants to return to Palestine, water rights, which are a big deal in that part of the world, and so on. It's very complicated. So then came the Clinton talk. So it's time for the open letter. But first, let's see what's inside of the globe. Oh, look, it's a collection of philandering American presidents. An open letter to Bill Clinton. Hey, Bill, so your talks probably came closer than any other time in recent history to an actual peace deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak was willing to give up more land currently claimed by Israel than at any time in the past. Even Yasser Arafat was surprised. Although not all the questions got addressed, you were definitely closing in on something. But in the end, it didn't happen. And since then, not to criticize you, things have gotten kind of worse and worse and worse. Worst of all, that was your big legacy moment. Now all you've got is the conflict in Northern Ireland getting resolved while you were president. In short, it...
Hold on. You're going to criticize Bill Clinton here. He did everything he could, and he wrote in his book, you're right, Yasser Arafat was surprised at how much Israel was willing to give up. But no matter how much Israel was willing to give up, Arafat and the Palestinians were not about to accept any deal. There was no deal that was going to be good enough for them. Because in the end, the goal is to drive the Jews out and to have all of the land, as they say, from the river to the sea, be Palestine. So no deal was going to be good enough. And to not recognize that reality on the ground is just willful ignorance.
It would have been amazing, but instead it was kind of meh. Kind of like your presidency, actually. At least you'll always have those vodka-soaked hugs with Boris Yeltsin to look back on. Best wishes, John Green. So the Clinton talks failed, Ehud Barak's government was undermined, and then in September of 2000, Prime Minister candidate Ariel Sharon led a group of 1,000 armed guards to the Temple Mount in the old city of Jerusalem. To Muslims, this is known as the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and it's the third holiest site.
Okay, to be clear, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the bottom left of this big platform area, you see there's a big gold dome, and then lower down there's a smaller iron looking dome, and then to the left of that you see a minaret, and that area where that dome is to where the minaret is around, that is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The rest of the area is the Haram al-Sharif. Is what the Muslims call it. Of course, this whole area once held the, 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, once held the temple, the Jewish temple, the Beit HaMikdash, and so this whole area we call the Temple Mount, since it's the mount, the mountain that King Herod flattened to build a magnificent, large Jewish temple on. That it's that makes this site holy. If you see over here, I'm circling, but if you can't, just to the left of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, you see there's a drop. And there's a staircase thing that's going on over here. That over just past that, this is where the Western Wall is. This whole wall is, the whole wall by that ramp thing is the Western retaining wall of the Temple Mount, and is the closest access point to where we believe the Holy of Holies in the temple was, the most holy place in all of Judaism. And so we call it Har HaBayit, so the mountain of the house of the temple, and in English it's called the Temple Mount. And under an arrangement that Israel has struck with a Jordanian force of religious police, the Waqf, Jews are only allowed to go up there sometimes and are never allowed to pray there. It used to be Jews could never even go up there, but that's really unfair. And Jews want to be able to access that site. And there's no reason in an egalitarian country why Muslims should have a right to go up there to what might be the third holiest site in Islam, but Jews don't have a right to go up there when it's our holiest site in our own country. So, again, a little bit of background that's important for you.
Mecca and the Prophet's Mosque in Medina. And it's the holiest site in Judaism, so in short, it's a pretty touchy place to march to with 1,000 armed guards. So the event sparked a massive protest, which eventually led to the much more violent Second Intifada, in which more than 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis were eventually killed. In 2000.
Okay, this again needs context. He puts it out as if more Palestinians died. And it's true, more Palestinian people did die. But cause and motive are extremely important. These Palestinians were not killed by insurgent groups or terrorists or anything. They were killed while in the act of causing terrorism. Many of them, he's counting, died when the bomb that was strapped to them exploded. So you cannot equate. It is the worst form of moral relativism to equate the lives lost. If somebody gets on a bus or goes into a pizza shop with a bomb strapped to them and kills 10 people, you can't say, it's not right to say that, oh, a Palestinian died also and these Israelis died. That's not right. Israeli forces often have to commit to security operations in order to stop terrorism from happening. Finding bombs, finding roadside IEDs, finding guns, finding ammunition, so that they don't use them against civilians, because their plan is never to use them against the Israeli military. It is and has always been to use them against civilians who couldn't possibly see it coming in the course of their daily lives. It doesn't matter what side of the Green Line. It didn't matter where the place would be in a future peace deal. That was not important to these people. And so, again, moral relativism is bad. Terrorists cannot be compared in moral worth to the people that they are murdering. That's wrong. And somebody has to say it, and he doesn't seem to think so I'm going to say it.
The Israelis, claiming to act in defense of civilians, began construction of a wall around the West Bank. But instead of following the borders established after the 1967 war, the barrier was built to include many Israeli settlements on the Israeli side. To Israelis, that was about self-defense. To Palestinians, it was an illegal land grab.
Was it an illegal land grab? Yeah, parts of it are an illegal land grab. It should be noted that he kind of said, oh, the security fence was put up supposedly to save human lives. It worked entirely. Numbers of suicide attacks against Israelis dropped to nearly zero. After that, Israeli civilians dying from terrorism dropped dramatically. So it was absolutely a life-saving effort by the Israeli government to prevent terrorists from being able to just waltz in to anyone's house and hurt them.
2005, Yasser Arafat died, and in an election shortly thereafter, Hamas won a majority of the parliamentary seats. Since then, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority have sort of divided how to govern Palestine, and it's also sort of been poorly governed. In the past 10 years, Hamas has frequently launched rocket attacks into Israel.
They haven't divided it. They fought a civil war, and now one group controls Gaza, Hamas. That's why there's a blockade on it by both the Israelis and the Egyptians, except Israel allows in humanitarian aid so that the people there don't die. And the West Bank is controlled by the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, after the Oslo Accords. But it wasn't by mutual agreement. He makes it sound like it was. It was a civil war.
Responded with extended and extremely violent invasions of Palestinian territory that have seen thousands of Palestinians killed, many of them militants, but also many not. Both parties claim to be responding to the provocations of the other, but much of the conflict reflects a consistent failure on all sides to understand the legitimacy of the other's narrative. To Palestine, the Palestinian people have been denied a state not just since the formation of Israel, but also for decades before that, and now they live under what amounts to a military occupation. And That's all true. To Israel, the Jewish people clearly need a homeland, which the United Nations established. And they certainly aren't the first nation-state to consolidate and increase their territory via military victory. And they need to protect their nation against the many active threats made against them by their neighbors. That's also true. It's important to understand the internal logic of these competing nationalist visions. For both Zionist and Palestinian national visions to eventually work, it's necessary to understand the right of each to exist and the legitimacy of each's historical narrative. But these problems aren't thousands of years old, and they aren't intractable. They emerged in the British Mandatory period. But let's hope that by understanding that this isn't an endless religious war, that we might be closer to seeing its end. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course.
So, once again, I generally like Mr. Green's videos. I think in this one he did, I don't know where he got his information. It sounds like it was Al Jazeera or something. It sounds like a really biased source, just from how he portrayed it. I really did like that end bit he said, though. An end to this conflict will rely on being able to recognize each other's claims that are not mutually exclusive as legitimate. So it will not require taking Israelis who say the Bible says it should all be ours seriously, and it will not require taking Arab nationalists or Islamists who say the whole land is a Muslim waqf, a Muslim holy territory, seriously either. Anyone whose claim is mutually exclusive is not to be taken seriously, but he is right that some people will need to see the other side's points as valid, even if they don't personally believe it. Thank you for joining me for this video. I know it's difficult. I know I paused a lot. I know I got a little fiery in there, and I just want you to know that I appreciate you sticking with this video and sticking with me. I'm presenting this information as accurately as I possibly can, based on the actual history that I've learned, not based on theological teachings, not based on any kind of animus or hatred, but just based on someone who would like to see peace and also cares very much for the truth being presented. Thank you for joining me. Please remember to like the video and subscribe and comment what you think, and I'll see you in the next video.